Hi, this is Andrew Lazarov. I'm doing my presentation on the environmental analyzation of U.S. military burn pits as part of a systematic review. So what are military burn pits? So these are open-air waste disposal methods used in overseas operations. They're not limited just to the U.S., but the U.S. in particular uses them quite a bit. So they dispose of many different kinds of waste that we'll get into, but in general, the pollutants that are done by combusting this waste are PAH, carbon monoxide, ash, formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds in particular, and heavy metals. These pollutants usually come in the form of smoke, which is done, so the exposure is mainly through inhalation, or sometimes through skin, such as eyes or mouth and mucous membrane contact. These MPBs are very large in size. Some have been measured as being multiple football fields long, and with particulate matter, it's kind of hard to gauge because when they study particulate matter, they also gauge dust and wind. And of course, with these different geographic areas, that can be very complex. So the particulate matter itself is very high range, with reported ranges from 104 to 10,000. So many, many times above the air quality standard. So this is a very complex exposure method and different pollutants. So our research question is generally broad. What is the exposure amount and impact of MPBs? So the objective of this review remains in procuring and analyzing the potential impacts and exposure amounts of military burn pits or simulated military burn pit compounds towards U.S. personnel. So here we have our methodology section. In general, it was very broad because, as I said before, it's a very complex topic, so I wanted to generate as many reports as I could and then analyze and filter them that way. So in general, we researched only on PubMed. These were the terms that were used. Here's our inclusion criteria. So as you can see, again, very broad. In general, we excluded non-English language published reviews, and then we limited to experimental studies, human cell experimental studies. Of course, randomized controlled trials, by its nature, we cannot do for ethical reasons. So we mainly focused on surveys, chemical analysis, cross-sectional and observational studies. We limited the dates from January 2015 to April 2025 in order to be more updated. Our outcomes are also vast. Multiple outcomes are done within one study. But in general, we are looking mainly at the exposure and impact of actual or simulated military burn pit pollutants. So here's our PRISM flowchart. We started with results of 579, and then we only needed 15 sources for the systematic review, so that excluded pages 12 through 58 of the results. And then records were manually screened by title and abstract. And then we also excluded non-accessible articles, which just means that they weren't available through my institution or through paywall. And so we arrived at our source of 15 reviews. And here is our list of sources. Again, because of the complexity of the topic, there was a lot of data that was analyzed. There was even a second page to this description, but we will be talking more in depth on the data extraction table in the next section. So we needed to analyze just how important it was to talk and research this topic. So for example, a cohort study of 500,000 veterans from 2001 to 2004 found that 85.5% were deployed to bases with burn pits, which was an overwhelming need to examine what the potential effects of these burn pits are, because they impact so many people. And these were just veterans. That doesn't include civilians or the environmental contact and effect long term in these areas. So in general, the outcomes were linked to respiratory conditions. Different respiratory conditions were examined, such as asthma, CRS, apnea, and then just general lung function as well. Other outcomes were also examined, such as cancer rates, urinary tract infections, and functional status. By functional status, I generally just mean respiratory conditions, but they weren't as specific as the other content, so they were put in their own category. And then we have experimental studies. So in vivo in animals and in vitro with human cells, they examine cytotoxicity and altered gene expression. With gene expression, the results are generally very dense, so I limited it to a summary. Burning plastic was the most harmful to mice that was found. And one study linked rheumatoid arthritis-related antibodies with an adjusted OR of 1.66. And then we also examined a biomarker study because you can self-report surveys as much as you want to examine potential exposure, but you don't know if they actually have that exposure. So a biomarker study found that, yes, there were specific pollutants linked within their biology that overall concluded that, yes, this specific group of people were exposed and they had these compounds within their system. So in summary for the results, 1 in 5 cohort and case control studies did not find adverse effects. 1 in 5 self-reported surveys did not find adverse health effects. And all experimental studies concluded adverse health effects in humans and animal models. So what does this mean? So before we actually go on to this discussion and conclusion, we need to talk about the study limitations because, as I've talked about, this is a very complex topic with a bunch of caveats that have to go with it. So some limitations include, and this isn't included for every study, but some studies showed small sample sizes, selection bias, inadequate comparisons, and a lack of confounding variable adjustments. And there are reasons why these studies had this limitation, and that is because of concentrations of pollutants vary. The type of varying individual makes a difference in the impact. It's very similar to nutrition studies where there's so many different compounds and different variations in human biology that it's generally hard to categorize. But in general, the important impacts are healthy deployer effect, which just means that people who are deployed are generally more healthy than the general population, which causes complications with statistical comparisons. And then the experimental burn pit simulations used a limited set of materials, which I found to be important, such as plastic, diesel, plywood, cardboard. And the documented list of possible military burn pit materials actually can include much more, such as insect repellent, fabric, lithium batteries, excrement, various plastics, transportation devices such as vehicles. They've even had computers, food waste, animal carcasses, and in general, it was documented to use jet propellant or fuel as an accelerant and other different kinds of metals, which of course could impact even more the adverse effects of these materials when they are lit on fire. So in general, highlights. Evidence suggests a potential association between military burn pit exposure and adverse health outcomes. We already know that the compounds that are created by incinerating these materials are hazardous to environmental health and safety. Some are even labeled as carcinogenic or causing birth defects. So adverse health effects, such as cancer, may develop over years or decades, making it difficult to detect clear associations in current studies. So in conclusion, the present systematic review results provide majority evidence that military burn pits negatively affect environmental safety and health. Specific associations need to be further examined due to the complexity and diversity of chemical compounds in military burn pits, which may provide varying effects over varying lengths of time to varying individuals. Overall, further preventative measures for exposure, detailed long-term surveillance, and use cessation for military burn pits is recommended. So there is a very strong knowledge that they cause adverse health effects. The question mainly is how much and what the concentration is and things of that nature, the minute details. So let's examine the current regulations for MPPs. So in general, they are inconsistent, so they vary across public and contract sectors for regulations, and they are generally seen as poorly enforced. As I've said, U.S. air quality is not in a great range for many of them. And there are some regulations, but again, not quite enforced as well. Many remain contaminated due to lack of environmental cleanup. So these cleanups generally cost millions and millions of dollars in order to make safe again. We currently have contaminated regions. We've cleaned up some, but in general, the majority remain overseas in specific islands, this Puerto Rican island, the Philippines, and parts of Europe. And as I've stated before, military burn pits affect not only U.S. military personnel, but also local civilians and local wildlife and foreign military forces, which shows that this is an international concern and not just one aspect or one place. So here's our recommendations for future management of military burn pits. So if they continue operating, they should have personal protective equipment, such as respiratory protection. A lot of these military bases, even if they have access to these, they aren't generally used. And then we have a possibility of shift rotations. So not just one person managing the burn pit over consecutively. It should be a shift rotation should be done. And then, of course, most important for epidemiology is comprehensive record keeping, which should be implemented for health tracking and environmental exposure surveillance in order to determine association and potential causation. So environmental cleanup of former military burn pit sites are essential to limit long-term hazards, but due to the high physical and environmental safety of military burn pits, I recommend that they be shut down immediately and alternatives made available, such as contained incineration systems. It's still not perfect, but it's a lot better than just open burn pits that are football fields long that you're breathing in, especially because these burn pits lift up because of thermal expansion. They impact a lot of people and a lot of wildlife. So here are the references that I used. The first 15 are the main source used in the review, and the others are general references. Thank you.